Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed, Conversations on Teaching and Learning. I'm Andrew Everett. I hope you'll take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. This is episode 28. Today, my colleague Arthur Takahashi is speaking with Dr. James Lang. Here's their conversation.
So, hello, everyone. Our guest today is Dr. James Lang, one of the biggest names in the field of teaching and learning. Dr. Lang is a professor of practice at the Acclaimed Center for Teaching Excellence at the University of Notre Dame. He writes a regular column for the Chronicle of Higher Education and co-edits a higher ed book series for the University of Oklahoma Press. He's delivered keynotes and workshops at more than 300 colleges and universities around the world, and even consulted with the UN on ethics and integrity resources for educators. Dr. Lang is the author of several popular books on teaching, including Distracted, Why Students Can Focus and What You Can Do About It, and also Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning. And you may also have heard about him for Cheating Lessons, Learning from Academic Dishonesty, which is a book that was published before ChatGPT came out, but offers insights that are especially relevant now in the age of generative AI. So in today's episode, we're going to explore how those lessons can help educators handle the challenges of AI-related cheating. And on top of that, Dr. Lang has a seventh book on the way, which is called Write Like You Teach, taking your classroom skills to a bigger audience. And we're going to be hearing more about this new project too. So Dr. Lang, again, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our show. We're super excited to have you here today.
You bet. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
All right, so let's start by learning a little bit more about you, Dr. Lang. Can you tell us why you became interested in teaching and also in writing about teaching?
Yeah, so I come from a family of teachers, actually. And so my mother was a teacher. My sister is a school principal. My brother's a university professor. So we have a lot of teachers in my family. My wife is also a teacher. And so it's sort of been, our family has been very education focused from, my whole life. And so I started, I really went to graduate school because I was interested in my subject matter. I loved English literature and philosophy, my undergraduate majors, and I want to just sort of continue learning about those issues in graduate school. But I definitely found that when I got in the classroom for the first time as a graduate student, it was interesting. It was very challenging to think about how to tackle the issues that come up in a classroom and then get excited about conversations that you could have about students. And, you can do a lot of learning and enjoying reading literature on your own, but when you open those conversations up to other people, it really creates more opportunities for you to learn and hopefully for them to learn as well. So I got very interested in teaching, almost, even though that was sort of in my family history and I was around educators all the time. It took essentially me to be in the classroom and see how challenging it was to really embrace the work and find it intriguing and fulfilling. So I started teaching in graduate school, like many people who get in English programs. We start with teaching composition and intro to lit and stuff like that. So, and then how I got interested in teaching about writing about teaching was because I got my first job after getting my PhD was at the Center for Teaching Excellence at Northwestern University, which was where I got my PhD. And I was really just looking for a part-time job while I was finishing my dissertation. And I got a job there just kind of helping out with the graduate student programs. And then again, likewise, I got interested in what they were doing. And I started thinking about, the challenges that I was facing in the classroom. If I did research on those in the library that we had at the center, and then, writing my way through those challenges, just got, kept drawing me to that work. And so it's kind of like it wasn't accidental in some ways, because I was definitely sort of oriented toward education my whole life. But the fact that I wasn't necessarily looking to either become a teacher or write about teaching, but just sort of getting into a classroom and then being intrigued by it. And then I've always solved my problems through writing. And so then whatever problems I was having in the classroom, I was just writing about them. and then sharing that work with other people. And that's kind of how the whole thing started.
Okay, that's interesting. So let's talk specifically about one book that you've written, which is called Cheating Lessons. Can you tell us about your research on academic dishonesty, how it started, and what led you to write a book?
Yeah, so that book I wrote after I'd written a book in 2008, which is sort of a guide to your first semester of college teaching for like new instructors with Harvard University Press. And honestly, that book came from my editor, actually. After that book had been out for a while, she said, and she wanted she offered to come to Worcester and take me out to lunch. And she said, I was at a conference recently and everyone was talking about, cheating. And would you be interested in writing a book about that? Initially, I said no. I said, that's not one of my big areas of concern in my life. But I thought about it for a few weeks, and then I started doing a little bit of research on that. And then I thought, actually, there's interesting stuff here. And I discovered a book in that initial research, which was taking on the problem of cheating through the lens of teaching and learning. Now, this was a book by Tricia Bertram Gallant, and it was called, I can't remember the exact title, but and so I thought, well, if this is actually a teaching and learning problem, well, then I could be interested in cheating from that perspective. And so that's kind of how I decided to go into it. I'd be willing to write that book, but not just sort of look at why people cheat for moral reasons or try to think about how we prevent cheating from like technologies, but like if it's a teaching and learning problem, and so how do we try to solve that problem by thinking more clearly about the ways we design learning environments. So that's kind of how that book arose.
Yeah, and that actually is a perfect lead to my next question, because one of the arguments that you make in the book is how we need to shift our focus from the student to the environment when we're thinking about cheating as an academic issue. So could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think typically our initial thoughts when someone cheats is that that's a bad person, or that person has just made a bad decision, or our first focus is on the student and the decision that they made. And I think, of course, that there's something to that. We have to do that. But I've always thought about, but I can't change a student, like in terms of like their morals or like the decisions they make at midnight. On a Tuesday and the paper is due on Wednesday at noon. Like I'm not there for that moment. So like I'm not sure what I can do in my classroom to help that student in those moments when I'm away from that student. And also like, yes, maybe I can sort of have an effect on the student's character, like over the course of a whole semester. But like that student's taking 5 classes and like has a family and all these other things are impacting that student's character. So my opportunity to sort of shape the character of a student is kind of limited, actually. And so I was trying to think, well, so what can a faculty member actually do? Well, what I can do is control the environment. And so if the environment plays a role in the student's decision to cheat or not cheat, well, then I can play a role. I can play a role in helping the student. The phrase I like to use is be their best self in the classroom. So I can't always be there to sort of shape their self from childhood to now. I'm not there for all that process, and it's a long developmental process. I can help shape the environment in which they make their decisions, and that's the classroom and the assessment. And so, I do always try to emphasize to faculty members. I'm not saying that we should not ignore the students' behaviors or like not hope that we can't help that student become a better person. But in a single class period or a single assessment, I have limited power to do that work. And so I want to do what I can, and what I can do is shape the environment.
So that's a very empowering thought, right, for faculty, because now we can do something about it. And your research identifies 4 key environmental factors that push students toward dishonest behavior. And you mentioned an emphasis on performance, high stakes writing on the outcome, extrinsic motivation for success, and also low expectations for success. Could you perhaps walk us through how these environmental factors play out in a typical classroom?
Yeah, I mean, so you can sort of, some of these things are pretty, they're close to obvious. Like, so you think about like the motivation of the student. So if the student is interested in, for example, just taking the class because they're trying to achieve a goal of like, graduating and get a job, and the class has they see no connection between the class and their ultimate goals. Well, they have a fully extrinsic motivation there, and if there's something gets in the way of their achieving that goal, that makes them more likely to cheat, right? So especially if they're not being given support or encouragement or being drawn in the course material in some way. Or, for example, like low self-efficacy. Again, if I'm a student who believes that, for example, I'm not good at math and I can't pass math classes because I'm not good with numbers, but I have to take this math class to graduate. Well, and if I find myself facing a test and I've done all this studying and it's still not working, well, I feel like I have limited options at that point, and so cheating is one of them. And so these are things that probably, we can probably reason our way to when we think about the reasons that people cheat. But I do want to just note, this book came out in 2013. There's a much newer book now that I was one of the editors on, called The Opposite of Cheating, by David Redinger and Tricia Bertram-Gallant. And she's the one that wrote the book that inspired my book. And so they sort of positioned that book as being like the third in a series, right? It was Tricia's first book, then my book, and then their book now, which just came out this month, March of 2025. And they kind of expand the factors, and I think they do a good job of adding some new factors I think are worth taking into consideration. And I'll just give you one of those factors too, which is what they call neutralization. Yeah, neutralization, like neutralizing. That's it. And so the notion there is that, if I don't see reasons behind the rules, or the rules don't apply to me in this particular situation, it's easy for us to sort of justify misbehaviors like cheating, for example. And so like a perfect example is, you're driving in a lonely road. There's no, like in a desert, and you can see everyone, there's no other cars around you, and the speed limit's like 25 miles an hour, and it's a flat road, and you're thinking, well, this is stupid. I shouldn't have to obey that rule right now because I can go to 45 and still be completely safe. And so that's neutralizing. So we see that the rules exist. I see the reason for them, but I'm just like, well, it doesn't apply to me in this particular situation. I think that's another factor that definitely plays a role. I didn't talk about it in my book, but they do a good job of explaining it and adding a few other ones that I think are worthwhile thinking about. So we can then think about all those factors, for example, like a classroom situation. So the easiest example to give is like for like a high stakes environment in which there are like just a few opportunities to earn my grade. And so these are the environments in which, for example, I just have like a midterm and a test, and that's my only opportunity, those two tests, to get my grade. And I'll put the other factors into play there. So this is a course I have to take to graduate. It's not a course I wanted to take. I don't feel like I'm good in that course. And also like this is a way that students will neutralize sometimes is this teacher's a bad teacher because this course is poorly designed. And so it's the result, because of that, it's okay for me to cheat because the teacher did a poor job. And so all of these things are playing into my decision. And so this one decision that the teacher made in the course design, which is to create, just these two opportunities for the students, high stakes, is shaping all that student's decision to cheat. So, the teacher could do something different there, have more active learning, more formative assessments along the way. And some of those things will take some of the other pressures off that are pushing that student toward cheating. So, I do like to emphasize the faculty too. You can just have the most perfectly well-designed course, and some students will still cheat, right? There are bad people in the world. There's, sociopaths and people that just sort of don't believe the rules will ever apply to them. And so, we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much when, cheating happens in a well-designed course. But we can always ask ourselves that question. Was there anything that was here that might have contributed to that student's bad decision? Is there anything I could do differently next time? And so that's the reason actually for the title of the book, which is called Cheating Lessons. And the idea is that the lessons are for me as a teacher. So what lessons am I going to get from looking at my own assessments and my own course design to help me do a better job of becoming a better teacher for the next group of students?
And if we can focus a little bit on AI now, since that's the elephant in the room, right? So generative AI tools are now part of our learning environment, whether we welcome that change or not. And you mentioned that when you came up with this idea for the first book, it was because a lot of faculty at the time were talking about cheating. Well, we are talking about cheating in this context now, right? Of generative AI. So which of these environmental factors do you think are most likely to encourage AI-driven cheating? Or should we even be thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely seeing a resurgence in interest in academic integrity. Actually, the Cheating Lessons has had a little bump up in sort of sales, and people asking me to give workshops on academic integrity at this point because it's pretty recent since AI came around. So these topics are perennial, apparently, unfortunately. So yeah, I mean, I think that the factors are still the same. The big underlying factors are still the same. And the course design and assessment design are always going to be part of the process in a student's thinking. Some of the things, the sort of things for us maybe are sort of like newer. It's just the fact that if the student has that, for example, like less of that interest in the course itself and feels the assessments are useless, they can now much more easily get this AI to do the work for them. And so it's more like an intensification of the factors I think that have already existed. Likewise, like one of the factors that Redinger and Bertram Gallen talk about is procrastination. And, I kind of was very aware of this. And I mentioned in my own book, which was, 12 years old at this point. But I was less, convinced that I could do anything about that as a teacher, about students' procrastination. And so that's an example too, though, how procrastination is definitely driving AI cheating to a certain extent, right? Because I can wait till the very end now and get it to do my work in like a 5-minute burst. Yes, I could procrastinate and plagiarize in the past, but still I do some it requires some copying, pasting, some research on the internet for a student to do that well, and stitch the paper together. From my various sources, but it's just the time frame. It just really has shrunk at this point in terms of how quickly they can get something done. So I'm not sure the factors have really changed so much. Maybe the one that could be changed is the fact that the neutralizing here has now focused on the notion that, it's stupid to have me do this assignment because AI can do this work for me. And so that could be probably this neutralizing thing maybe is stronger now than it was in prior time periods. So that may be the big change that I can see.
Well, so since we have sort of identified the context and the problem, right, that brings us to solutions, right? Because that's what faculty want to hear from you. So one of the ideas that I find most compelling in your book is that the same strategies that reduce cheating also enhance student learning. Right, so can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, let's talk about the student's motivation for a class, or the student's belief that they can be successful in a class. And let's take the idea of sort of low self-efficacy, in which students feel like they don't have the skills or the particular brain they need to achieve in this class, specific class, or this specific assessment, whatever it might be. I think the last 10 years, we've learned a lot about how to help students boost their self-efficacy. And in teaching lessons, I talked about, for example, like the growth mindset, which I think is still absolutely an important thing for us to think about. Many students feel like they're not good writers, or they don't learn languages well, or they don't do math very well, and students really still have all those beliefs, and we can help them learn better by showing them the research on actually the plasticity of the brain and sort of educating them about how brains work. Growth mindset, folding that into our assessments. But at the same time, we're just getting much better at noticing or helping students, providing students with supports, and helping them understand study strategies. There's so much that's coming out right now in terms of like the neuroscience of learning and cognitive psychology of learning, and there's good research on there's a great article called "Strengthening the Student's Toolbox" or Toolkit, which had a bunch of things that's aimed at students that can help them understand how to study better. I think probably students didn't realize that actually just rereading and highlighting the text is not a great way to learn something, and that actually if I change my study habits, I can be successful in this class. So that's a case in which we have really, I think, have learned a lot in the last 10, 15 years. And we can now help students understand those ideas more clearly. And we can be more transparent about how they can be successful in their courses. So that's, for example, like one thing that we can do is we as teachers can educate ourselves about, okay, how students are studying in my class and how I can help them become better at that. And that can even just include, for example, like taking that article and putting it in your LMS and say, this article is available, spend a half hour in class on it and saying, if you're typically doing these study strategies, these are actually really not good for you. These other ones, though, will really help you. If you want to be successful, you feel like you're stuck in your writing, well, try these ones. And so now I'm doing a better job of helping them get over that self-efficacy piece, so I don't feel like I have to use AI because I can't do this on my own. Or another example would be the student who feels like, well, this course is disconnected from my interests or my life, my career goals. I think we can get better at that as well by inviting students to make better connections between what their career goals are by inviting them to think about that, and not just sort of, me just saying, here, this is going to help you in your job. Well, when I was 19 years old, someone told me that, I'm like, okay, what do you know about me, about my life, in my life? Right? So, I was contrarian, I still am, but, right? So but I have a better understanding now, okay, but wait, I can tell you these things, but you tell me. So you tell me about your career goals and what matters to you, and can you see any pathway between your goal and this? And then really giving them an opportunity to think that through writing. And that means bringing more personal voice in the classroom, and their personal voice, not mine, right? So I want to give them opportunities for them to sort of make connections between the course material, things they observe in the world around them, their goals, what they're seeing in their parents or their lives or their siblings, or things they see on during, for example, things that they're watching in television, movies, all that kind of stuff. So I want to give them those opportunities, not only to see those things, but then tell me about them. And so we can do a better job then of helping them see how they can motivate themselves, as opposed to just me sort of trying to convince them these things are important, which is, I think, typically the strategy we usually have.
Yeah, so that would be what you call the intrinsic motivation element, right, of course design. And so that's to combat, I guess, I don't know if that's the best word, but to combat the extrinsic motivation factor. And you mentioned a few other things too: student self-efficacy, helping students understand that, yes, they can succeed in this course. You mentioned also the low-stakes assessments, breaking down those, big assessments, perhaps 2-3 exams that we have in our course, but break that down into low-stakes assessments. Could you also perhaps talk about mastery learning, what you mean by that?
Yeah, so mastery learning is sort of we contrast mastery learning with performance learning. And performance learning essentially when I'm really focused on performing well on this particular thing that I have right now, especially when I compare myself to other people around me. For example, I want to make sure I have the highest grade in the class, or the highest grade in this particular assessment. And so that's sort of like a performance-oriented thing, like a competition. Like an athlete, for example, is sort of looking at their performance in relationship to the other people in the field. And mastery orientation is more focused on me achieving this particular goal, crossing this particular barrier or threshold for myself. And so I'm not so concerned about what other people are doing or trying to compare myself against some impossible standard. I'm really focused on trying to get these skills mastered for myself so that I can grow and achieve whatever goals I have for myself, like long term. So, for example, people often will think about like, thinking about like other realms of life, right? So am I, running against myself when I'm like, for example, trying to learn to run or for a sport? Am I sort of trying to just become the best person in for a 5K and get to first place, or just continue to like get my best time for myself and feel how good that is to have this sense that I've done something I was not able to do in the past. In the classroom, then we can think a little bit about things, for example, like giving students more autonomy over their how they get their grade, essentially. So, for example, I can have like multiple assessments in a class period, in a course. For example, like students have these 10 things they can do to earn their grade, and they only have to do 7 of them. And then that gives those 7 give enough for the student to get that highest grade in the course, whatever it might be. Or, for example, even in like a quiz structure, there's sort of like 10 quizzes over the course of the class period. Well, I only have to do well in 8 of those quizzes, right? So we're thinking about like, creating more opportunities for students to just think about, okay, you have all these ways can be successful. You can be successful. They'll be slightly different than everyone else in the classroom because they have the same choices that you'll have, and they might choose differently. But then you have the opportunity then, put together a package that shows you're successful in mastering these achievements or these goals in the class period. So that's one way to think about mastery is a way to achieve that in a course.
Okay. Yeah, so it seems like almost with mastery learning, like it's helping the student compare herself to himself or herself, not to the class as a whole. Right?
Yes,
I'm
sort of really understanding how do I want to grow as a person, right? And so I'm trying to grow as a person by mastering this particular skill or this body of knowledge. And that, for me, that's sort of expanding myself and helping me see how I can go forward in my life, right? Because if I just sort of compete against this particular group of students this semester, in this time period in history, well, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm good at it. I'm just better than these particular people in the room.
So are any of these strategies more efficient in preventing students from offloading their work onto AI? In your experience, have you seen some of those strategies like play a bigger role in that?
The research on AI and cheating is just so new because AI is so new. It's kind of hard at this point still. We don't really have like the huge scale surveys that we've had over for example, there were a series of surveys that would have been done over many years with International Center for Academic Integrity, ICAI. And so we have those benchmarks from like the 1960s, another set of them from the 1990s, and then some additional ones going forward, like maybe even as far as 2011. We haven't had those yet, actually. So it's kind of hard because those surveys will not just say, like, for example, how many people are cheating, but like also, like they'll ask questions about like, what things do you cheat on? Or like, we'll ask other questions about, other areas of their lives, which can help us understand why they make these decisions in a particular context. And so all that kind of stuff will help us see. It's hard at this point because we just don't have those huge surveys right yet. I think they're coming. And actually, we did one in Notre Dame in which students were asked about how often they use AI when they were asked not to, these were like first year students in like writing and language classes. And so we sort of got an overall sense of how much students were doing that work. And it was, it was heartening to see, actually. 2/3 ish students were saying, I never do that. I never use AI for my learning when I'm not supposed to. Other students were saying, maybe, but I'm not quite sure if I'm doing it wrong or right when I'm using AI. So that sort of gives the teachers something to think about. How clear are we being about when they can be used or not be used? There was a small number of students who were saying always, I'm always using AI. But that's always been the case. There's always been a small number of students who are always cheating. And that number was pretty low. And so, we're going to get these things in drips and drabs until we get that. Probably ICAI is one that will probably give the big survey that can help us see what the whole picture looks like. We don't have that yet.
Okay. And what about like a change that you have made to your courses? Given now that we have ChatGPT and other text generators. So what is one change perhaps that you have made in your courses that you saw, perhaps made a difference?
Yeah, so I had a little bit of a sabbatical from teaching for a couple of years. I taught my first class actually this last summer in a while. So that was my first class having taught with AI in the mix. I didn't make a huge amount of changes except for the fact that we did one activity in class in which we had them we put one of our assignments in and sort of showed them what AI would do with it, and how we'd sort of be able to compare that with what a student would do in that particular assignment. It's like a demonstration of here's what AI does. Here's why you wouldn't be learning from this if you chose this route, and actually why we care more about hearing your voice as opposed to hearing the voice of this machine when you're trying to resolve this assessment. We did a lot of essentially talking about why it was important for them to learn the material. But otherwise, I think my teaching has always leaned pretty hard on in-class writing. And that was either not always like writing by hand. Oftentimes, they do their work on their laptops, but still in-class writing, things like, a lot of formative assessments, other kinds of assessments too, not just like written assessments, but also, for example, like sort of presentation style assessments, or having them do, actually I've always had not a lot of exams and more like quiz-based stuff in class as well. So a lot of my teaching has always been the assessments, a decent amount of it has been, the assessments have been in class. So that's historically been the case for me. I think that's actually very common in writing classes. This was not a writing class, but it was sort of writing intensive. So I think going forward, that's probably, I'm hope to start teaching again in the fall. And I think I'm going to still probably just stick to that plan. And I always believe, that there's only so much we can do. At a certain point, the student has to make the decision for themselves. And so I feel confident that I can do everything I can to to ensure that I've done the best job to create the environment that will inspire students as best as I can. And then some students may still cheat, and I'll respond to that when it happens, and try to work with that student to understand why and how they could recover from that, and make sure that we maintain the integrity of the course. But, when I have to, design a new course in the fall, we'll see how it goes. Check back with me.
Sounds good. Yeah, one thing that I love about what you said is that you basically opened this line of communication with your students, right? And something that you mentioned in your book that I, really, struck a chord with me. You say that based on the research, it's not really the code or the course policy that prevents students from engaging in academic dishonesty, but it's really the conversations that code or that course policy sparks, right? And it seems like that's what you're going for here, right?
Yeah, there's a great article, and it came out after AI, but it doesn't really talk about AI, but it was like 6 low effort strategies to combat cheating in a college course. And it was striking to see actually, so these instructors actually had, researchers had the instructors, compare what they used to do to course in which they use these sort of low effort strategies to reduce cheating in their courses. And they were successful. Like the results were absolutely successful. And what I noticed about these strategies were they were sort of continuous. There was not just a sort of like the one-time first day of the semester, look at your syllabus, and I'm going to tell you what the policy is. I'm going to tell you not to cheat. Here's what the penalties will be. These low effort strategies continued throughout the semester. And students got multiple reminders about academic integrity. And also, they included success strategies. And so when the assessments came around, the students were reminded of, by the way, here's the ways to get help when you're struggling on this assessment. And this was just really, I think it's really heartening to see the difference that these efforts, low effort strategies made. And they were low effort. I mean, they did not require a lot of time for an instructor to put into practice. And so I think there's a really it's a heartening thing to see. These things matter. Start the conversation, but then keep it going throughout the entire semester. Which, by the way, I know is challenging because we don't like to talk about this. We don't like to acknowledge the fact that people might cheat in my class. It's uncomfortable. And it's uncomfortable, this notion that, we have this sort of, initially in the first weeks of the semester, we're trying to build a relationship with the students. And we want them to be trusting and say, I trust you and I hope you trust me. But at the same time, we clearly know that students do cheat. And so we have to sort of be willing to acknowledge that and say, I know this is a temptation. We all are tempted sometimes to do things in the wrong ways, but I want you to know this, you don't have to do that. These are ways that we can be successful and be aware of this is something I take seriously. And so that's the sort of goal, is to have that conversation, not just start and then finish on the first day. It has to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier in our conversation is this concept of neutralizing. So this is new to me because I haven't seen this book yet. But the idea that now, students may be thinking, why do I need to write this paper, if I can offload this onto AI? Well, what if some instructors perhaps are thinking, well, why should I assign this paper if I know students can use AI to complete this paper? So what would you tell instructors in this case if they have, this kind of thought or perspective?
I don't like that notion that you shouldn't just use an assessment just because AI can do it for you. Because, one major thing we know about learning is struggle benefits learning, right? So like the fact that sometimes I have to struggle through something and I come around on the other side of it and my mind has grown. The skills have now been more firmly embedded in my brain because I struggled through the process. And so, the promise of AI is to make things more efficient, easy, more economical. And those things can be great in certain situations, but actually they're not always great for learning. And so that's why, we don't just give students, for example, like a book and say, okay, read the book and then you'll be done with this material. No, we force them to actually work through it and do the assessments and sit in class and do active learning activities or take the exams. All these things, these are examples where students have to struggle and actually push themselves beyond where they are now. And that's true also for these traditional assessments that we might say, well, should I still be using these? And I would argue largely yes. For example, students like basic things like writing an outline and organizing a paper, even like a traditional work of literary analysis, like in my discipline, for example, there's value to that because there's certain skills I'm developing as I write even a 5-page essay, which is people say, oh, that's a terrible assignment, and but it's kind of like a training wheels assignment, and it can help students think about the basic things. How do you develop a thesis? How do you develop that thesis and support that thesis with 3 points? Yes, the 3 points is restrictive, but it's also enabling. right? The student says, okay, I only have to make 3. I don't have to think about how many things I have to find to support my thesis. It gives me a container, a form that I can work in, and that within that form, I'm developing the basic skills. Now, I want to go beyond that form, obviously. So I don't write 5-paragraph essays for the rest of my life, and I'm not going to use that form very well in the future. When I have the basic things mastered, the teacher then has, okay, now let's take those 5 paragraphs and expand them in different ways. And what would that look like in a presentation? The skills you've developed. And so as a teacher, it's okay to start with those basic assessments because they're helping students learn to write a thesis, organize 3 ideas, and what order do they belong in, or building a paragraph around a topic sentence. Like, this is a very essential skill versus, again, all these things are sort of take an idea and then how do you support it? How do you frame it? How do you orient it toward your audience? All these things can be learned in these very basic assessments, traditional assessments. And then once we have them mastered there, then we can take them in other roles. Now, the challenge that people will say, that, for example, like someone will say, well, that we shouldn't be doing that assessment anymore because it's not relevant to authentic assignments or something like that, like authentic things that people do in the world. They're right if you stop there. But I would never argue that we should stop there, right? Like, you start with that 5-paragraph essay, but then you go beyond it. And, then by the end of the semester, we're doing more creative things. But I want to be able to help students start somewhere that's comforting to them, and initially now enables them to do the work because it's not that difficult, not too challenging, but then I'm going to keep pushing them beyond that. So traditional assessments are still a great place to start. And I'm probably bucking against the grain here a little bit to say, I think authentic assessments are great, and we should push ourselves toward them. But not every assessment has to be this huge creative thing that is different than everything else we've ever done in the past. I actually don't believe that. We need training wheels sometimes. We need like sandboxes. We need ways that students might. I'm coming from a high school, and we've always did everything like this in high school, and I need some transition periods here, where I'm trying to then transition assignments. Absolutely. Where I know how to do this like this. Now you're pushing me to go a little bit further, but you're not, confronting me with something completely different that completely different what I've ever done before. So I think transition assignments here and traditional assessments can play that role.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one question that I have is, and I mean, you may have faced this before. I certainly have, and I know some other faculty that I've talked to have faced the same issue. Let's say, you design the perfect course. There's no such a thing as a perfect course, but you design a pretty good course, and with intrinsic motivation built in, mastery learning, low stakes assessment, student self-efficacy, all the things that the research tells us, would decrease cheating. Yet we still have a student perhaps that used AI, or we suspect that a student used AI to complete an assignment, and that assignment has all the marks, the hallmarks of AI. We don't have solid proof to accuse a student of using AI. So what do we do? What would you recommend faculty do in that situation?
This is kind of an evolving area because, obviously the main thing I've kind of learned from, we have hosted events at Notre Dame. What I've learned is that what faculty are doing is they're running it through AI detectors right now. That's their first thing. And actually, most people are doing it through multiple detectors. So they're kind of aware of the research vaguely about the fact that these detectors are biased, or they're not effective, or create these sort of false positives. And so they're kind of aware of that, but they're still doing it because they don't know what else to do. And so I think that there's some people are sort of the research, how those things are working, how they work, and there's sort of misunderstandings about how they work. And so people, first of all, sort of educate themselves about what the detectors do, and they don't always work in this. They all don't work in the same way. And I'm not like 100% against them because they can be a tool just for starting a conversation. And so I would argue if people use AI detectors, that's what they should be used for. Inviting students to say, okay, so, I have concerns about the voice in this one. It doesn't seem like your other, things you had to do right in class, or that, for example, that using these some of this stuff feels like it has the hallmarks of AI writing. So just tell me what your process was like. And so, like, I think that's okay to use them in that way, but there are better ways to approach it at this point. Still, for example, like having students do some kind of in-class writing activity that you can compare this. So you have like a low-stakes opportunity to hear their voices in class. Ways to change assessments that allow students to use more of their voices in their writing. That's not always possible in every discipline, but our goal really is to start with the ones I think are good for learning, but also prioritize students' voices. Having said that, I'm not totally against AI detectors, because if I have concerns about a paper initially, and then I use some of those detectors, and then that affirms my concerns, and they're all showing the same high level, like 100%, this is possible, AI. It's an opportunity to start a conversation. It can be, I would never use it to say you cheated on this, or that, I'm 100% suspect that now this is AI. It's an opportunity to give a conversation to start with a student, to say, tell me what your process was like. What I've heard from faculty members is many times when students will say, okay, yes, I used AI in these particular ways. And they might also say, was that wrong? And so that's an opportunity to, educate those students. I will say also the AI detectors are probably going to evolve in terms of how they, and actually there's some, I've been hearing there's like the watermark detection thing that's evolving now and may become more effective than the ways that people they work now. So there will be a little bit of arms race here, no question about that. But I think anyone that looks at the research on cheating, it's hard for those of us who are like very well aware of that research to say we should take anything out of the toolbox, right? And so it's a tool that can be in the toolbox, but it's one that requires very careful use.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so before we wrap up, I'd love to hear about your new book, which is coming out in April when this episode is published. And the new book is called Write Like You Teach. So can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so this book was really coming from the fact that it was bringing together my two sort of lifelong, professional pursuits, teaching and writing. And the premise is essentially contained in the title, Write Like You Teach. And the notion there is that, especially now, I think we're seeing this, in post-election, that it's really important for academics to sort of make the best case for the work that we do, and not just offload that work to journalists or to a public who maybe doesn't clearly understand the value of academic research, or that we want to to do a better job of translating the work that we do in our labs, in our offices, in our archives, to a broader public beyond just our disciplinary colleagues. And this book is essentially designed to help academics do that, to think a little bit about like what are the things that I could do to make my writing more accessible, reach out to audiences beyond my disciplinary colleagues, and not maybe even other academics, but then even beyond other academics to like a broader public. And to do that work, the book argues, just think like a teacher, right? So when you're putting together an essay or a book, think what you do in the classroom. How do you organize a body of knowledge for students? Because students are essentially like your readers who are outside of your discipline, right? So how you would teach, for example, like a first year class in your discipline, like the introductory class in your discipline. So what would you do in that class? How would you structure that body of knowledge? How would you sort of repeat things, or like have sort of memorable stories you would tell the students to help them to illustrate the big ideas, right? So all these things that we do in the classroom, sometimes informally, like for example, like sharing personal anecdotes, right, as a way to illustrate our connection to the topic. Well, I can do those same things in writing. And so the book essentially puts like a structure around those things that we do in the classroom that are effective for learning for non-specialized learners and puts them into the structure of a piece of writing. So, for example, the ways that we the questions or problems that we address in a book, the evidence, the forms of evidence that we use to support our ideas, the way we make our the language more accessible to people in the classroom, but then also on the page. Think about humanizing our persona. Like we typically in the classroom, we share little tidbits about ourselves. Even just, I had a terrible commute today in class today, or one of my kids was sick this morning, right? So we share these little things in the classroom, and we can do the same thing actually in our writing too. We don't have to spill our guts in the page, but we don't do it in the classroom typically either, right? And so we can find these parallels between the classroom and the page that get more people drawn into our writing and our subject matter.
Yeah, and something that you mentioned is the word accessible, right? Making your research accessible. And this is something that I've seen in your books, including cheating lessons. So did this approach, this idea of making your own writing more practical to your readers and more accessible to your readers, did this approach also influence the way you wrote Write Like You Teach and the idea behind the book?
Absolutely, because I think one of the easiest way to illustrate this is, the forms of evidence that convince people, right? So, for example, like if I'm thinking about like students in a classroom, but also like my readers. So, if someone has been writing about teaching for multidisciplinary audiences for a long time, I kind of have realized if I want to convince people to adopt this teaching strategy, I have to give an example for the humanities, one from STEM and one from social sciences. And because I know, though, that people are convinced by different things. Like, a STEM researcher wants the experiments, the numbers, the labs, right? If I want to have a humanities person, I want to tell them a story. And they're convinced by the stories. Or from and a social scientist might be convinced by the surveys. So as a writer, I've kind of learned to sort of expand the forms of evidence I use in my own writing. Well, the same thing actually holds true in the classroom, because some students will say, they zone out when I'm, in for example, a humanities classroom, when I'm just sort of telling stories or whatever it might be, but they lock in on the numbers if I, tell them something that's numerical, right? And then and vice versa. So, and definitely that has absolutely shaped the way I've written for a long time. And I started noticing this in very successful nonfiction trade books, for example, like the big ones that we sort of think about as, like the Thinking Fast and Slow, those big sort of psychology books, or, big idea books, essentially, right? And you see the same, they do the same thing. They'll tell little, historical anecdotes. They'll talk about personal anecdotes. They will then also show examples of surveys and data, and they put all these things together. And so to me, that's a great way to think about how do we expand our audience, make our writing more accessible, draw more readers in. Well, we give multiple forms of evidence because each form of evidence will appeal to a different kind of reader.
Absolutely. So why do you think that academics often struggle to communicate their research to a broader audience?
Yeah, it's a good question. And honestly, the reason I wrote the book was because I feel people get often blocked and say, well, there's some special thing that happens here when I have to translate my work outside my disciplinary journal to like someone who's just reading the newspaper, for an op-ed about my subject matter. Like there's some, for them, many academics, it looks like a mystery. Like I don't have those writing skills. And the goal of the book is to say, listen, you have these skills, you have them, you use them in the classroom because you're doing that translation work on an everyday basis to novice learners. And so the book is essentially just like an enabling move to say, okay, if I just take the things I do in the classroom and I turn my head to the page, I can use the same strategies. I think the reason probably often happens is we have this sort of expert knowledge, right? So like as an expert, I'm deeply embedded in the field, and so I lose sight of what a new learner needs to sort of understand the discipline. That's a problem in the classroom too, right? So this is a problem that can come up in the classroom, and then it happens also in the page as well. And that might be the thing that sort of is the barrier between me crossing over. Well, point of the book is to say, but you do it. You do it on a daily basis in the classroom. So you can still, you can do it in the page as well.
So there are strategies there for any instructor in any field.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, but stay with us. And when we return, I'm going to ask Dr. Lang our continuing the conversation questions. And that's the question that we look towards the future, but thinking about AI in higher education. So stay tuned.
Got a teaching idea worth sharing? Share it on AU Teaching Commons. We are Augusta University's first peer-reviewed hub of open teaching resources by faculty for faculty. Share your knowledge, help your peers, impact students. Visit us at guides.augusta.edu/AU Teaching Commons.
Welcome back, everyone. It's time for our Continue the Conversation question, the part of the show where we explore what's on the horizon in higher education. And in today's question, we're going to tackle the future of AI in higher education with Dr. James Lang. So Dr. Lang, I'd like to ask you a two-part question. Right, so as generative AI evolves, one, how should educators continue to approach academic integrity? And then two, what excites you about the future of teaching in the age of AI and generative AI?
Okay, so I think the first one to think about is a couple of things I'd like to think about with moving forward with the age of AI and academic integrity. The two AIs, academic integrity and artificial intelligence, is to think about. There's a phrase that I've been using, which comes from a book called Next Generation Genres by Jessica Singer Early. And she wrote this book actually to talk about particularly like writing genres and how we have to move forward with like writing genres going forward. This actually came out after AI was introduced, but is not necessarily focused on AI. And I want to make the case now we have to think about next generation assessments. And we still want to have the traditional ones that we think help support learning. Well, like what's the next generation of assessments that we should be using going forward? And I think it's an exciting question to think about. Like, what are the assessments that we should be using going forward, which may or may not incorporate with AI, but also are resilient with AI, and think about how those assessments support learning, create new learning. And so what do those look like? And I think Singer Early book has some of those examples in there that I think are good ones we could keep using to kind of translate our ideas in different disciplines. But I think the notion that of a next generation assessment is a good one to think about to inspire new learning for us as teachers. Like to give one example of that comes from the book. She talks about the notion of an artist statement. So you think about like you go to an art museum and there's like a contemporary artist, and they have a series of paintings on the wall, and on the wall there's also a statement from the artist, which is a couple paragraphs long, which says, here's what I did with these paintings, here's the materials I use, here's my vision for these paintings, and here's what I thought I achieved or didn't achieve in these paintings, right? Like an artist statement. I like the idea of having a creator statement for any work that a student might do in a class. For example, writing a traditional essay. So I still have that traditional essay. Then I also have like a writer's statement that I'm going to write as a sort of part of it as well, to say, okay, here's what I did in the essay. Here's what I struggled with. Here's how I used AI or didn't use AI. And I can do the same thing with a presentation, a project of any kind. So the notion now we're sort of pairing the product with a creation statement. To me, that's a great example of a next generation assessment. And we can go forward with that and make it even more AI, drawing AI into that process of the creator's statement. So that's the example of what I'm talking about there in terms of like the next generation assessments. And so that's way to think about how do we build assessments that are sort of more resilient to cheating, and also continue to inspire learning. Because what I like about that too is it inspires metacognition from the student, which we know is good for learning.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the first question. The second one about what excites me about AI going forward in the future and learning. I see there's reasons to use AI, and I think there's feels it's going to be obviously it's powerful, it's worthwhile, and it's interesting to see how things develop. And I've been working on actually with a team of folks at Notre Dame to develop an AI chatbot, which is focused on, was modeled on small teaching. And so this has been a year-long project. I've learned a lot about how AI works, and I see, what it can do and what it can't do. And what I've kind of learned from this, myself personally, I just don't find it that interesting. I have to tell you, because I just find it's when you get under the hood of it, and which I've been able to do a little bit, like some glimpses of it with the programmers. I just don't find it quite as interesting. It looked for me initially when I was from the outside, this amazing thing it's doing, and it is amazing in some ways, but it's also it is mechanical in some ways.
Yep.
And when I've seen that, I thought, well, I just still find human brains and human learning more interesting. I don't use AI in my own life in any way, and I see I could. I just don't find it. It doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't interest in me. It doesn't give me anything. It doesn't give me anything personally, like joy in my learning or a sense of accomplishment. And so I see there are other people that have to make that case. Essentially, I'm not one of the people that's going to make a case for incorporating AI into their courses. And actually, I'll say so. That's maybe a little less serious, but the serious thing I will say about this is, I believe going forward, some people are saying we have to use AI in every course now and build AI literacy by having course by course. And I think it's important to build AI literacy. That's really important, and we have to do that. But I also believe that's, let's say a student takes 40 courses in their undergraduate degree, right? Yes, maybe 20, 25 of those students are developing their AI literacy and maybe using AI for particular tasks in the course. But if 10 of them say no AI, that's great too, because the variety that students are getting over the course of those 40 courses is great for developing a whole person, seeing multiple ways they can grow and learn. I used to say the same thing, and I still say the same thing about having devices in the classroom, right? So yes, in many disciplines, devices in the classroom 100% are needed. There's other courses in which they're not needed or not needed, but the students will be able to choose. But in 40 courses, if there's 5 classes when the instructors say no device of any kind in this classroom, that's okay, right? So I'm giving some variety of the students' experiences over the course of their whole education. I think the same thing is true of AI, right? Some of us can sit back and say, we're not using here, and we're going to learn with our brains and with each other, and that's it. And that's fine. So to me, having a larger palette of student experiences with AI or devices is the best way, I think, for us to give them the most rounded experience.
All right. Dr. Lang, is there any question that I didn't ask you that perhaps you would like to comment on?
That was probably the last thing I wanted to say, actually, especially with AI,
okay.
is, I want to make sure that students who feel like, this is not for me, that's fine. It's okay. It's not for you. That's okay. As long as the students are getting it in their program as a whole in multiple classes, and I think we have to AI literacy is really important because we can help them to learn ethically and use it for learning or not use it for learning. But for the students, the instructors who are saying it's not for me, likewise, I feel the same way, and I think we're still okay to contribute to the student's education in different ways.
All right. Well, sounds good. Dr. Lang, again, thank you so much for talking to us today and for being a part of this show. And we just appreciate it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. Join the conversation and connect with us on Facebook at facebook.com/AUGCII. Visit our show page at augusta.edu/innovation to access resources discussed in this episode. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semester. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.